You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Welcome to the Christ and Classics podcast, where we read and discuss the classics in light of Christ. My name's Devin Wilkins, and I'm joined as always with the illustrious Colton Moore and special guest Keith Kresge, back in action. Good to have you with us, Keith.
Hi, guys.
Today we are discussing one of Lewis's essays. It's a total of 4 pages, and it is it's entitled "The Necessity of Chivalry."
Is that?
I believe this essay holds a special place in Keith's heart, and it has developed a similar place. Is that right, Colton?
Yeah, so actually Keith is the one who mentioned this essay to me at first. We were talking about something, and he brought this up to my attention.
That's good.
And then I listened, actually, about a day or so after, I listened to a lecture that Joe Rigney gave to a few students not too long ago, where he touched on, where he centered the talk around chivalry and used several of Lewis's characters in the Chronicles of Narnia to highlight the chivalric code, if you will. And I found it fantastic. And I've since then, which has been like a couple of months or so, 2 or 3 months, I've read it several times. I read it through with 4 classes of 7th grade students, and it was a delight. I'm pretty excited to discuss it with you two.
How do 7th graders do with Lewis's essays?
Not well, but with me with them, and with an overhead projector, with me with my pen, marking up and underlining, and them following me, and I'm slowly defining words for them. It took us like 2 days to read it. They did really well. It all centers around me reading, summarizing, defining terms, so that the idea is clear that we can discuss. And the idea itself is something that they crave if they can get past some of the higher language that Lewis gives us in this essay, which you have a teacher to walk you through it. Put a life jacket on you. You can swim in any depth of water with a life jacket.
Fair enough.
True.
So, Necessity of Chivalry. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, can you remind us, what is this essay about? And then you have the question, right?
I do. So it's if the whole essay is summarized in a quote by Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, which is a quote by Sir Ector talking to the now dead Sir Lancelot. And he says, quote, "Thou wert the meekest man that ever ate in hall among ladies, and thou wert the sternest knight to thy mortal foe that ever put spear in the rest." And Lewis goes on to explain that idea that there's a spectrum of being a man, and on the one hand, you're a man who is really familiar with the sight of blood and gore, which is a symbol of his warrior-like qualities, traits. And on the other side of the spectrum, he's as gentle and as meek as he needs to be among the ladies in the hall. And he says that a man ought to, I'm obviously interpreting Lewis now, he says that a man ought to not have one at the expense of the other, but have them both in the same man. And he doesn't go on to say this. He doesn't go on to say that how can that happen? But the inference I think we can make, a good inference, is that wisdom will tell you what context we're in. Where once into the spectrum makes its presence more than the other. He says that, quote, "The man who combines both characters, the knight in the medieval world, is a work not of nature but of art, of that art which has human beings instead of canvas or marble for its medium." And so getting this right, having both qualities in a man, is a work of art in a similar way that an artist would paint on a canvas. So he even goes on to say that society itself depends upon this attitude, this existence of chivalry in men. So on the one hand, he's a warrior, not afraid to fight and to kill when necessary. On the other hand, he's as gentle and meek and as calm and as delicate as he needs to be with the right kind of people. Keith?
Yes, sir.
How would you add or subtract to that summary and interpretation?
I think that's right. I would emphasize that Lewis is saying that there's two qualities that are inherently at odds with one another, and that nobody is born tending towards both, and that the chivalric or chivalric ideal is necessitates both, and that no one will achieve both by nature or by accident. I think that those are the key ideas here, is that these things are at odds with one another. They do not run in a pack. They do not, grow in bunches together. This sort of sternness and meekness, these two things are strange bedfellows, and they are the hope for the human race in some way. They are sort of the basis that society is protected and provided for. And so it's, society is sort of dependent upon their marriage in individuals. Not just that, there would be classes that tend towards sternness and classes that tend toward meekness, but that there would be at least some who fall into the chivalric ideal of marrying the two of them in their own person.
Yeah. And do either of you know what the prompt was for Lewis? I mean, or what is he responding to anything in particular, or is this?
This is just a publication in or an essay in something called Time and Tide, Volume 11 in 1940. It doesn't say that he was solicited for anything in particular. It's reprinted in several different places, but
1940 is certainly in the midst of, the beginnings of World War II.
There are allusions to sort of the active World War II scenario for them in this essay.
Yeah.
So I don't think we need to spend most of our time looking necessarily at Lewis's argument. I think we already agree with wholeheartedly his idea here. But I want to ask a couple of questions that are similar that relate more toward application and our current age. So my thought is two questions. Like, where do you see that this notion of chivalry in let's just really make it focus, our Western American evangelical context? Okay, and even then that's still really broad. But where do you see this lacking in our culture, our country, and the church here in America today? And then the second question is, I guess there's three. What can we do to fill that gap? And then it's like part and parcel. Like, how is Jesus Christ related to chivalry? Because like that's part and parcel with how to make it happen in the church. So first off, where's this lacking? that you see in our day and age in the church?
I mean, I think that everybody has a tendency towards one or the other of these two things, and has a second tendency towards, if they ever saw themselves as deficient in the one, they would tend to confuse that with being sort of too concentrated in the other, which is not in fact the case. Lewis is saying that you ought to be meek to the nth and savage or stern to the nth, depending on the context. You're not trying to reach a comfortable 55 degrees in between these extreme temperatures. You instead sort of, the polarities exist within you, and you are capable of extreme violence, extreme force, and capable of gentleness and genteelness simultaneously, always walking around with those things both in your tool belt. I think that societies and subcultures are probably going to trend one way or the other, but talking about the trends might be somewhat unhelpful. Generalizing, in my mind, is somewhat unhelpful in this instance, because I think there's a whole lot of nature involved rather than nurture. And so everybody needs to begin to assess themselves. I mean, each of us three here naturally have sort of an aptitude towards one and away from the other. And it's not going to be uniform for all of us. You know, one of us here is more.
You can't all be a fierce soldier like me.
That's right. But yeah, only one of us is going to sort of fit in a Stetson and spurs, right?
Oh, that's Keith, the farmer.
It's not me. It's not.
Well, can I ask you a follow-up question, Keith? Because I had written in my margins here, is this a spiritual art or an art of education? Meaning, is this the aim particularly of? I mean, he's going back to medieval Christian society, and he's writing certainly as a Christian. Is this a Christian art, chivalry, or is this more of an art, like a natural law kind of approach, like all America should be chivalric, balancing the ferocity and the gentleness? That was a question that was still kind of outstanding, and I was kind of wondering about his audience, but
yeah.
But
I
beyond that, it's.
I don't think this to Christians. I think you would say it's a Christian fruit that Christianity produced and developed in the Middle Ages. I don't really know the answer to that question very thoroughly, though. I'm inclined to think that he wants it for the populace generally, and he views it as a sort of an essential value in any society. I wouldn't say it's spiritual. I think it's not in a way that it's sort of unearthly, or just sort of like a I don't know, an emotional capacity for, or a I don't know, spiritual ability or tendency. I think it really is a sort of a lifestyle art.
And I mean, humans have understood this aspect of being a man. I think we can safely agree that we're primarily talking about masculinity in particular. I think you start men exclusively in this conversation. Right. Okay. Yes. Just wanted to lay that out there. I think that women can demonstrate this kind of aspect, but not primarily, like, it's not their general posture. Does that make sense? Like chivalry is primarily a man's virtue. It's a masculine virtue. And I'm trying to say that humans have have noticed this, recognized this as beautiful and fitting, ideal even for thousands of years. I mean, like, I think that's the entire purpose of the Iliad, chapter 6, when Hector, the greatest warrior on the Trojan side, goes back home and he embraces his wife. He picks up his baby, takes his helmet off, and he's gentle and meek to the nth in that regard, and then leaves and then slaughters the masses of Greeks. And so it's perhaps not too far, I don't think, to speculate that something like this is baked into our image bearing quality. Like there's something inherently spiritual about it, perhaps.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, I was kind of thinking like marriage is common, something created, and it is good, and something that, a non-Christian can have a pretty good marriage. But certainly I think we'd all say that, the marriage in its highest sense points to Christ and the church, Ephesians 5. And so there's a sense in which maybe marriage can be enjoyed by all, but maybe to the next degree among mature Christians. And I wonder if it's similar here with chivalry. Like, everybody similarly is called to, these kind of knightly virtues, knowing your context, doing one or the other, and the Christian especially so, ought to anyhow. Although I do think that the church is probably fairly confused these days.
Yeah.
Doesn't have the clarity that Lewis has. Well, let's just we three were up in Minneapolis for 4 years. Keith, you were up there for 8. And one end of have I been pronouncing it wrong? Chivalric? Is it chivalric and not chivalric?
It depends on if you're chivalric.
Oh gosh. Chivalric. So one end of chivalry was really emphasized where we went to church up north, and then you come back down to the south in the United States, and the whole other side is hyper emphasized to an unhealthy degree. I think, and I don't know. I just sometimes I hear a lot of like Jesus said, and he did. He said, if somebody slaps you on the cheek, you give them the other one. Lewis here is saying the ideal man is part fighter, killer, when time calls. And so like, how do we reconcile the call to meekness and gentleness and self-denial, turning the cheek that we find in the Gospels with this one side of chivalry that's a fighter warrior for all things good and just and true?
I think Lewis wants us to cultivate the art of both. So if you think of yourself and you realize, meekness is sort of my groove, or vice versa, sort of sternness, severity, machismo is the wrong word, but a sort of aggression is sort of my tendency. And it makes me a bore or brash in wrong circumstances, or you show up to a esteemed podcast wearing a ball cap.
You are welcome here.
Letter and a collared shirt, and you're wearing a ball cap. You need to shape up. I think it has. It's for me. It's most clear to see what I need to do when I start thinking about what do I need to do for my sons. Because I think we tend to want, if we have a tendency in ourselves, we're probably especially inclined to look to make sure that that's engendered in our sons also. If you value gentleness more than you value violence, which would be a mistake, because according to this essay, at least, you should be fostering a capacity for both to the nth degree. You might be, I tend to be more likely to sort of, he's a little boy. He's, it's all right if he sort of runs over, everything and hasn't respect for boundaries and isn't learning manners and those sorts of things. Well, as soon as this essay begins to make you think through how should we be changing that, you also begin to see, okay, what sort of things do I need to be cultivating in myself? Because you're not going to effectively shape anything into your children that you're not also shaping into yourself. But I don't know. I think this is kind of a hard sell. This essay is kind of a hard sell. I think there are probably a whole lot of people who aren't going to get off the blocks with it. Yeah, they're going to. Right now, I think that there's a polarization of sort of these values where some would say it's not a Christian thing to have a capacity for violence to the nth degree. That's not Christ-like. I mean, that stuff's making its rounds right now in Reformed evangelical circles. I think that has a lot to do with spats that are going on between PCA and other Presbyterian churches and even some Southern Baptist circles about sort of what was Jesus like. That might have been the context for me pointing you to this essay, was thinking about what is godly communication like. Because I think we tend to think words that are Christ-like are only gentle that won't quench a smoking flax, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think that's true at all. I think biblical speech, you need to be able to sort of spill the blood of your enemies with speech and heal the wounds of a fragile heart with speech. And both of those things are Christ-like and biblical, and not only lawful, but the sort of thing that we should be cultivating a capacity for. And I think it also, I personally think pacifists are in error on this point. But a pacifist would be somebody who would, in particular, refuse to cultivate the sort of one side of this paradox. And I think that'd be a mistake. I think it would be a mistake to sort of reject that for your sons. Just like I think it would be a mistake to, think that your sons don't need table manners and they don't need sort of respect for their mother and a sort of religious obedience to their mother. Those sorts of things are, I think that they're all in play here.
Yeah, that's so. I think this is where a robust, Christ-centered understanding of the Old Testament can help, because you find in the Old Testament that God is very violent. He's very fierce. He's very much acquainted with bloodshed at his command. And it's whenever we come to the New Testament, we now realize, Christ was there all the time when Christ was the one guarding Israel and leading them into battle. Christ is the one slaughtering the Egyptians in the Red Sea. Keith, I can see your face.
I have a small David Larson in my head.
Okay, tell me.
Not Christ, the Son.
Yeah.
But I know you. But I don't know if that's even right. My David Larson might need calibration.
I don't know, because it was Christ, the Spirit, Christ in them, leading the prophets to speak and guiding them, right?
No, the Son.
I don't think it'd be I know the Christ being the human, but
is Christ the anointed one before the incarnation? I don't know.
Yes, absolutely.
It does seem like there may be passages in the New Testament that are not as exacting as Brother Larson, but
we've Keith just opened up the depths of systematic theology for us.
So, I told you I was letting my hair down and pretending nobody was listening. Let's just set that aside. Set that
Well,
aside.
right. If we understand that the Son of God, inference being He is Christ, Jesus Christ, He is in the Old Testament, leading His people. Then that cannot be.
I do not think you can orthodoxly say that Jesus Christ is in the Old Testament.
Oh, yes, you can.
Because Jesus Christ is the incarnate Son of God, and the incarnation comes with Mary's the birth of the child from Mary. So I'm not sure about Christ. You might be able to say that Christ is in the Old Testament, but you certainly ought not say Jesus is in the Old Testament.
Well, the Jesus was the Lamb who was slain before the foundation of the world. He was already crucified before the world was created. In a real sense,
is pre-existent God. The Son is fully God, eternal from
right,
eternity back. But Jesus, Nazareth, comes about in history.
Yes, as the Son of God, but not Nazareth. Two separate things. We're not talking about two separate persons. The Son and Jesus.
I'd just like to say that you guys are being very chivalric, both fighting over this and at the same time expressing some civility about it.
That's a forced attempt to try to get us back on topic.
All I'm trying to say is that, like, let's just doctrine of God, doctrine of Scripture. We have an Old Testament, that's God's Word, where God is literally killing His enemies. And then in the New Testament, we have God coming as a meek, gentle man to save and to conquer and kill His enemies again, finally, but in the most unexpected way, through that meekness. Now, and I'm just trying to say that, like, the fact that Christ saves us through His meekness, His power manifested through weakness, doesn't necessarily nullify our duty to rise up and fight, perhaps even kill when necessary. That it's in God. Like when God meets certain circumstances, he's meek to accomplish a purpose, and when He comes in contact with other circumstances, He's a fighter to accomplish other purposes. What do you think about that?
I don't like juxtaposing Jesus and God of the Old Testament and saying the God of the Old Testament represents sternness and Jesus represents meekness.
That's fair.
I think
especially when you read Revelation.
I think the sternness are existent fully in Jesus Christ even before you get to Revelation. I think that John Piper, he talks about the mingling of tough and tender sayings of Jesus, and I think actually there's quite a bit more tough than there is tender. If you actually go through and you pay attention to, like, how many of Jesus's words are offending people and how many are just like music to everyone's ears. It's pretty rare that Jesus says something that's music to everyone's ears. So I agree with your sentiment. I'm not sure it was composed exactly how I'd like to compose it, but I think that you're right that Old Testament and sort of the bared mighty arm of God shows us the sort of need for this as we image Him in the Old Testament. I think that there's mercy and meekness throughout the Old Testament also. So I would say that you can see both ends in both ways in both. But I don't think that very many people value both. I don't think very many value both. And I don't think very many people are going to make a effective attempt to produce a Sir Lancelot with their sons. Because it's going to be pretty hard to pull off, actually. Because you're not asking a son to be, temper his zeal or his aggression with gentleness, go and sort of be aggressively gentle and then go and be gently aggressive. It's sort of, you need to develop two skills that really are at odds with one another. And sort of be able to do both of them all the way in the right context. I think that the paradigm that you introduced of wisdom is exactly right, Colton. Wisdom, though, would be the thing, the sort of understanding to know when to utilize which thing. I don't think that's not the first need, though. The first need is an ability to do both things. I would hazard to guess that neither or not any one of us here actually could do either of these things to the nth degree. So, we're sort of the lukewarm in the middle. We're not even so far along that we have one side pat and now we just need to focus on the other. It's like, the meekest among us probably needs to improve in that regard. And the most savage among us in our churches is still, not necessarily to the nth, the way Lewis is talking about.
Sorry, Colton. I do have a question about, so certainly when Jesus confronts the teachers of his day, he is stern and offensive. But, when I think of a lot of Jesus's interactions, say with those who need him, who approach him with a different posture than testing him or seeking some way that they might capture him and kill him or something like that. When he's dealing with those folks, it's a little less brash and offensive and more, it is more gentle. And then, when I think of, I'm teaching Philippians to my youth group right now, and the humility of Christ is kind of the chief virtue that is put forward, and he is the chief example. So I think insofar as chivalry is knowing, possessing the wisdom to know when is a time to fight and when is it the time not to fight, but to be compassionate, to have pity, to be gentle and lowly. I think Jesus, he exemplifies that throughout his ministry. And I think the problem for us today generally is, just as you were saying, lack of wisdom. And certainly also, Keith, you said that some just lack the ability. It hasn't been nurtured, perhaps I would say that I obviously trend toward the not so severe side. and so, there's that aspect, but then there's also, even when you do have the two, especially in a digital age, I find that actually people are a lot more ferocious than I thought. Before we all just drove into our garages and would see each other when we're watering the lawn or something like that and say, "Hey, how's it going, Bill?" But now you see what people say, out of the overflow of their hearts on the internet or on a podcast or what have you, but not necessarily in your normal days. And so I'm thinking, I guess I'm agreeing with you. I'm just externally processing here that there are two problems.
Right. The problem of knowing what to do is, I think, the secondary problem. I think the primary problem is an actual ability to do either of these things well. I think we can boil it down to like really sort of, I don't know. It would seem like, I don't know what the word would be. Nitty gritty things. Just how many of us could put our oldest, if necessary, could put, who is it? Is it, it's not in, it's in one of the epics. Help me out, guys. The flee from Troy and into the Italian peninsula is the Aeneid. And I think it's Aeneas that puts his father on his back and carries him out of the burning city. Like, raise your hand if you can do that. Right? Like, who here can go 4 miles?
Although he loses his wife in the process.
Who here can go 4 miles or 10 miles with their aging father on their back? Right? I mean, even something as like small as physical fitness that might be frowned upon as needless or even vain. That sort of thing is absolutely what Lewis has in mind here. And then there's the affection bit, a sort of ability to sort of delight and roar in the battle the way Lancelot is said to have done. So I think that we're a long ways from this ideal.
But it sounds like one remedy, and you mentioned it, Keith, is one remedy, one step that we could take as fathers is to try to make this chivalry more a part of our own lives practically, and also instill it as far as we can into our young men, so that when the time's right, brother can defend his sister from the dangerous bully at school. He can take a black eye because some kid was about to beat up his younger sister, and yet it's nothing for him to do something as simple as hold the door open for a lady he doesn't even know, or to help carry groceries for an elderly woman that needs help, for example. It's like habits of chivalry in these small ways that we can instill in our young men, and this will set them up for future encounters with women. Like the way that they treat their mother will be the way that they treat their future spouse or lady that they're going to consider to be a spouse. And this plays directly into what Lewis is saying here. The way that he defends his mother will be his training ground, if you will. The way he treats his mother and his sisters is like the training ground for actual, they are actual, but like other encounters with women, particularly a woman that he may consider to be a future bride. And so the culture is fighting against it. That's just my thoughts about
I think it's also a useful rubric to give to your daughters as they think about like who's a worthy husband. Like, hey, you want to be seeing both these things, right? Like, ferocity is not a bad thing, but ferocity to the totally absence of gentleness, deference to parents, an ability to honor the elders, those sorts of things. That's a real bad thing. Similarly, like the nice guy who's just a wimp and doesn't have a capacity for any ferocity is, that is not attaining to the ideal either. And of course, it's going to be tough to sort of dictate that if you're not modeling that, right? Like if you.
Yeah. Can I?
No, go ahead, Devin.
Sorry to cut you off. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
Nope.
You're done?
Good. Go on. Done.
I was just going to say, so the knightly virtue seems to me primarily like he can be something on a battlefield and he can be something else in a home or in society. But it seems to me that when a lot of people talk about, the ferocity and the gentleness of a man, that we actually don't have real battle in mind anymore, very much anyhow. But actually, just think about, there are times in my life I'm gonna have to fight, and there are times in my life where I'm gonna, be gentle. I'm just thinking, like, if he's writing during, the onset of World War II, and Christ maybe similarly exemplifies this virtue of chivalry, but I never see Christ, violent in a physical way. And he does advocate, the day-to-day, turn the other cheek genuinely when somebody reviles you, or not reviles you, but actually strikes you. There are certain cross sections of Christianity that today, evangelicalism today, that I would think would have a hard time, in the name of chivalry, have a hard time not striking someone back in the day-to-day. Not war, but maybe somebody's attacking you for your faith or something like that. It's one thing to say, I'm protecting my daughters and my wife. Another thing to say, I'm defending my country. But when somebody says, hey, that Devin, he's a pansy Christian, and smack him or something like that, then at that point, I mean, the wisdom piece becomes big and primary, I think, because,
Not primary in the sense of first. It's still secondary, because the question of wisdom is only a question if the capacity for both responses is present.
Yeah. So not primary chronologically, but ever just as much primary in significance, because, what good is having both if you don't, right? So, yeah, I'm thinking in the essay and scripture, and they both seem to be pointing toward actual warfare. And he uses the Iliad, actual warfare, not so much how I act when somebody, I don't know, when somebody offends me.
Well, yeah. Okay. I see what you're saying. Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think he has in mind, in the sweep of history, the actual need to rise up as a society and go to war for the preservation of your society. But for him, the gentleness or the genteelness or the meekness is the sort of thing that understands and enjoys and fosters those things that make a society worth having during peacetime.
Right.
I don't agree with you that Jesus did anything violent, because he, even before his resurrection, he did.
But that's far less violence than, I mean, we could count them on one hand. I mean, not a lot of violence.
I think we only have one episode, and then we have the sort of Christ in the eschaton, wading in blood.
Right. Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Carrying the whip.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, I mean, I think Christ exemplifies the capacity for this in his ministry, just as I think today the tightrope he's walking is often a group of people who think he's here to overthrow the Roman Empire, or overthrow, earthly powers. And so he rejects that as a matter of policy, not as a matter of sort of rejecting violence per se, I don't think, as is clear through his zeal for the holiness of the temple and his willingness to overturn tables and flog those who are fleecing the flock.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, guys, we could
give much time a 4-page essay.
Yeah, We have lots of great things. Yeah, I love this essay. It's encouraging. It's encouraging. Well, Keith, as always, it's a delight to just talk with you.
It's good to be with you.
Yeah.
Whole kind of be with you.
Yeah.
It's a sharpener.
Yeah, wherever we are.
Yeah. Well, okay.
Up, go to bed.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, my excuse for it's a good excuse to have, but I always say, it's really late when we're recording these, and so I'm not as sharp as I would be otherwise. Although that's probably not true.
Wow.
No.
All right, gentlemen.
Thanks for coming on.
See you next time.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.